Chapter 6. Ancestors. Evolution and the birth of Adam. In popular consciousness, if not in scholarly opinion, the theory of evolution finally killed off Adam. Widespread reports of the death of Adam, as several books have been entitled, have cemented this impression. John C. Green's Death of Adam, for example, is subtitled Evolution and Its Impact on Western Thought, and the first port of call in The Death of Adam by the Pulitzer Prize winner Marilynne Robinson is Darwinism. In fact, both of these authors are much too sophisticated to attribute to Darwin the assassination of the idea of Adam. Green's account is really a subtle and striking narrative of the decline of static creationism since the time of Sir Isaac Newton. Robinson's is a critical philosophical engagement with how the new Darwinians conceive of human nature and in particular their denial of human exceptionalism in the state of nature. Nevertheless, the sense that Adam was finally exterminated by Darwin and his disciples is widely shared. In place of that image, I want to suggest that for a significant body of opinion the coming of evolution meant the birth, not the death, of Adam. The thought here is that for those wanting to retain continuity with the heritage of Adamic theology and yet are persuaded by evolutionary accounts of human origins, the suggestion that Adam was born of pre-Adamite parents, that he had a direct genealogical lineage, found considerable support. Adam had a navel, for Adam had ancestors. Evolutionary pre-Adamism. This chapter in the story, then, modulates the narrative that has been unfolding in several more or less significant ways. First, at least in the hands of some, it marked a departure from the conventional association of pre-Adamism with polygenism. By identifying the Adamic family as the direct descendants of forebears and as a relatively late arrival on the stage of natural history, it preserved the unity of the human family. Not that common descent inevitably implied racial equality. Evolutionists such as Thomas Henry Huxley and Darwin himself, we should recall, saw no reason to deny racial inferiority and superiority because humanity's common ancestor was pushed so far back into evolutionary history that it predated the emergence of the human species. It simply confirmed the consanguinity, a favorite expression at the time, of the human family. A monogenetic form of pre-Adamism was thus now available in the marketplace of ideas. How its champions negotiated a range of doctrinal questions springing from this scenario will attract our attention in the pages that follow. Second, and again this applied more to some than others, these new arrangements raised metaphysical questions about the human constitution and, in particular, about how the dualism of body and soul was to be handled. One strategy was to suppose that Adam's ancestors had undergone physical evolution to the point that a hominid body was suited to receive a human soul. This version allowed for both an evolutionary and creationist account of the appearance of Adam at the same time. Third, advocates of an evolutionized pre-Adamism sometimes, but not invariably, allowed for the continued existence of pre-Adamite stock and speculated on the relationship its members sustained with Adam and his family. In some cases the translation of other hominid groups into modern humans was countenanced, in some cases not. Whatever the precise shape this revisionist pre-Adamism assumed, the consequences for science, theology, politics, and history spiraled off in new and unpredicted directions. Such, of course, is the way with all harmonizing systems. Designed as they are to retain continuity between scientific discovery and theological beliefs, in fact they are mutually transformative, they alter both the scientific and the theological architecture of their patrons. Reconciling schemes are not to be thought of as neutral, disinterested joints holding together two limbs, or simply as bridges between two independent domains. There are, rather, more like a solvent that dissolves two substances to produce a new compound. Once adopted, monogenetic pre-Adamism, like its polygenetic predecessor, channeled the intellectual and political energies of its champions along certain explanatory axes and obliged them to reorient both their theology and their science in one direction or another. The suggestion that Adam's body had been subject to evolutionary transformation but that direct divine intervention was required to create his soul, owed a good deal to the writings of the English biologist and Catholic convert St. George Jackson Mivart, a critic of Darwin's theory of natural selection to explain the interim stages in the development of a useful structure, a criticism that Darwin took with great seriousness and sought to answer in later editions of The Origin of Species. He was nonetheless convinced that evolution had taken place. And in the same year, 1871, in which Darwin's Descent of Man appeared, he brought out his own account of the genesis of species. Here he spelled out what he considered to be a scientifically robust, and theologically acceptable, account of human origins. Mivart was certain that Adam was born, not directly created, at least in the physical sense. It was not until the 12th and final chapter of this volume that Mivart turned his attention to such matters. By this stage he had already laid out his own account of the evolution of species, highlighting his central critique of natural selection and advocating his own teleological conception of evolutionary development, which drew on the writings of the Irish amateur naturalist John Joseph Murphy and emphasized the correlated actions of internal and external forces. So far as the human species was concerned, Mivart insisted that the human body was evolved from pre-existing material, symbolized by the term dust of the earth, and was therefore only derivatively created, i.e., by the operation of secondary laws. The soul was created in a quite different way, not by any pre-existing means, external to God himself, but by the direct action of the Almighty. This was as true for the first man, Adam, as for all other humans. As Mivart put it, that the first man should have had this double origin agrees with what we now experience. For supposing each human soul to be directly and immediately created, yet each human body is evolved by the ordinary operation of natural physical laws. This strategy allowed for empirical interrogation of the evolutionary history of the human physical form but exempted the soul from such scrutiny, for, he assured his readers, physical science, as such, has nothing to do with the soul of man, which is hyperphysical. Mivart's dual origin hypothesis opened the door to the possibility of genuine Adamic ancestors, who were cast as subhuman in some critical dimension. Although Mivart does not seem to have resorted to the language of pre-Adamism to depict them, others, as we will presently see, certainly would. His proposal, unsurprisingly, was not uniformly welcomed. Huxley, for example, despite his friendship with Mivart, was soon dashing off to the St. Andrews University Library to ferret out a copy of Suarez to pronounce that Mivart simply could not be at once a faithful soldier of science and a loyal son of the Church. Mivart thus found himself marooned, as Adrian Desmond puts it, between the reactionary Pope and the militant Darwinians. Huxley was only too happy to use the occasion to vent his spleen on every last trace of scholasticism and to stage himself as science's defender against papal dogma. And later, spurred on by the critical attack launched on him by the Irish priest Jeremiah Murphy, Mivart found himself on the receiving end of ecclesiastical censure. His defense of scientific freedom just went too far, and several of his later writings on theological subjects were placed on the Holy Office's list of forbidden books. Nevertheless, at the time when On the Genesis of Species appeared, expressions of support for his understanding of human evolution were certainly heard. His book received agreeable reviews in several Catholic periodicals, for example, and despite his personal antipathy to evolution, Pius IX was willing to confer on Mivart an honorary doctorate. Whatever supporters or detractors thought of his dualistic device, Mivart demonstrated at least to his own satisfaction how to retain the historical significance of Adam and yet allow for evolutionary transformism. Plainly, Darwin had not obliterated the Adamic family. Nor for that matter did the advent of Darwinism sound the death knell to polygenetic speculations. In fact, as we will see in Chapter 7, polygenism lingered long in the thinking of post-Darwinian anthropologists, who found a number of ways of denying the common origin of humanity. Among the set that congregated around the Anthropological Society in London, for example, a racialized polygenism continued to thrive, and it was similar in the American South. Indeed, Darwin's own writings could be read through polygenetic spectacles, for as George Stocking reminds us, he granted that a naturalist confronted for the first time with specimens of Negro and European man would doubtless call them good and true species. Simply put, race formation was so remote that today's racial groupings had been in existence for an immensely long period of time. For all intents and purposes modern races were polygenetic. But what is also readily detectable is that among many of those who still held on to the idea of an original Adam and yet were persuaded by evolutionary theory, the development of a pre-Adamite theory that was severed from its polygenetic moorings became rather attractive. These writers argued that Adam had human, or proto-human, predecessors, from whom he was descended, and that all were traceable back to a common point of origin. A monogenetic rendering of pre-Adamism thus began to exert appeal. Alexander Winchell and monogenetic pre-Adamism. Perhaps chief among those who ruptured the ties between pre-Adamism and polygenism and helped pave the way for the cultivation of a monogenetic variety of pre-Adamism as a strategy for harmonizing biblical anthropology and human evolution was Alexander Winchell, a leading American geologist and Methodist layman whose Adamites and pre-Adamites appeared in its first incarnation in 1878. Winchell's efforts to mediate between science and religion earned him at once considerable acclaim and notoriety, including dismissal from Vanderbilt University. In two critical respects Winchell materially departed from much conventional thinking about human origins and theology. First, while other apologists often flirted with the pre-Adamites as simply an anticipative tactic, Winchell actively embraced them as the only means of maintaining the credibility of biblical chronology in the face of scientific revelations. Second, His thoroughly monogenetic version stood in marked contrast to the polygonism of the American school of ethnologists, which was spreading like wildfire, though as we will see in the next chapter, it was no less virulent in its racial typecasting. Winchell enjoyed a distinguished career in American science both as a geologist and as a reconciler of science and religion, and throughout his life he retained a typically Arminian enthusiasm for natural theology. His academic career was largely spent at the University of Michigan, where he variously served as professor of physics and engineering and later of geology, zoology, and botany. For a short time he was first chancellor of the University of Syracuse, having been appointed to that position in 1873. And then in 1876 he moved to a chair at Vanderbilt, which only required him to be present in Nashville for a couple of months each spring. It was summarily abolished in 1878, and he returned to Michigan in 1879 to serve as professor of geology and paleontology. Besides publishing numerous technical works on petrology and mineralogy, Winchell contributed regularly to the Methodist Quarterly Review and thereby assumed the role of purveyor of science to the Wesleyan connection. In this latter role he saw it as his task to keep his coreligionists abreast of the most recent scientific developments and to modify traditional harmonizing schemes as required. His rehearsal of the teleological argument, for instance, departed from the Palean norm as he resorted to the idealistic, or, better, homological, version associated with such figures as Richard Owen and James McCosh, which located divine design in archetypal plans rather than in specific organic adaptations. In his Sketches of Creation, for example, which came out in 1870, he pointed to various scientific resources that could widen the remit of natural theology beyond its familiar horizons. Geological investigations, he noted, were uncovering evidence of the appearance of new organic forms related to, but different from, earlier ones yet revealing an identity of fundamental plan. At this point his espousal of the idea of 4 fundamental types of organism as the blueprints on which all life was modeled predisposed him to doubt evolutionary theory. But he soon moved toward theistic evolution in its neo-Lamarckian formulation, which allowed for the appearance of adaptive features by means of natural law, albeit within certain limits. Thus, when he brought out the doctrine of evolution in 1874, he contended that it was clearly the law of universal intelligence under which complex results are brought into existence. In this work he laid out a detailed conspectus of the various schemes of what he called organic derivation, discriminating between the proposals of figures such as Darwin, Huxley, Alfred Russel Wallace, Alpheus Hyatt, Albert von Kolliker, and Carl Gegenbaur, all of which demonstrated an intimate familiarity with current proposals. Like many of his contemporaries on both sides of the Atlantic, Winchell certainly expressed reservations about aspects of the evolutionary program. He could not see, for example, how altruism could be produced from a mechanism, the struggle for existence, that was inherently selfish, and further argued that the principle of selection required the action of intelligent will. He worried, too, that Darwin's own proposals seemed to require a widespread simultaneous appearance of new adaptive forms for which no generating mechanism seemed available. Nevertheless, he found the general principle of evolution compelling, and within 3 years he had declared his support for the neo-Lamarckian mechanism that was being promulgated by Edward Drinker Cope. The author's present conviction, he told the readers of his Reconciliation of Science and Religion in 1877, is that the doctrine of the derivation of species should be accepted, and that the most tenable theory of the causes, instrumentalities, and conditions of this derivation is that propounded, in 1868, by Professor Edward D. Cope. Winchell's project now was to demonstrate evolution's compatibility with theism and to do so in a way that avoided both dogmatism and denunciation. And his strategy was to move away from teleology to homology, thereby locating divine design less in particular contrivance than in overarching plan. Theologically sculpted though his version was, Winchell's outlook was now a conspicuously evolutionary one. Nor did he hesitate to expose his sentiments to Methodist audiences. The April 1877 issue of the Methodist Quarterly Review, for example, ran an extended review of Huxley's 1876 New York lectures on the direct evidence of evolution. Here Winchell, while registering dissent from some of Huxley's claims, confessed, "We are pretty strongly persuaded that the doctrine of derivative descent of animal and vegetal forms represents the truth. We now think it is far safer to accept the hypothesis than to reject it. It is safer for the scientist, it is safer for the Christian. The paleontological record, empirical evidence of species variability, and developmental embryology all conspired to render plausible the evolution hypothesis." Prior to his appointment to Vanderbilt in 1875, then, Winchell had given voice to his evolutionary sympathies, and he continued to strengthen this allegiance after his arrival in Nashville. But during his time there he had found it necessary to keep a careful watch on his tongue, and when he did fall foul of the university's Board of Trustees, he noted in an explanatory epistle to the readers of the Nashville American on June 15, 1878, "I have always taken pains, in my lectures at Nashville, to avoid the utterance of opinions which I supposed were disapproved of by the officers of the university." What he had in mind was evolution. As he saw it, this is what lay at the roots of what he described as his dismissal from office on account of heresy. He went on, "This heresy consists in holding with the great body of scientific men, that a method of evolution has obtained in the history of the world, but not in holding that man is the product of evolution." The language of heresy hunting, of course, was a rhetorical jibe recalling the fate of Galileo some 3.5 centuries earlier, for when the strategically placed Bishop Holland and McTeer quipped, "We do not propose to treat you as the Inquisition treated Galileo," Winchell spat out the rejoinder, "But what you propose is the same thing. It is ecclesiastical prescription for an opinion which must be settled by scientific evidence." The most distinguished scholar on the Vanderbilt faculty at the time, his dismissal caused quite a stir, not least because, as Paul Conkin caustically quips, in the person of Winchell, Vanderbilt actually came close to hiring a person who flirted with originality. Indeed, Andrew Dixon White, who later would publish his immensely influential History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, wrote to Winchell from Paris, saying that his name would occupy a prominent place in so important a matter of history. Winchell was now on his way to iconic status in the annals of science-religion history. In the minds of many, Winchell included, evolution was his downfall. As he noted of his chief adversary, evolution. "This is the bugbear so big and black that nothing else could be heard or read by Dr. Summers, whenever I employed tongue or pen." But there are good reasons to suppose that evolution was not the only factor in Winchell's removal from office. Far from it. After all, his views on the subject must surely have been known prior to his appointment. Indeed, it turns out that other matters were implicated, matters having to do with human racial difference and non-Adamic humanity. On this issue, too, Winchell had tried hard to manage his speech. Before coming to Vanderbilt, he had written 2 long essays for his fellow Methodists on the religious nature of savages and barbarians, in which he surveyed a wide range of natural historical, archaeological, and anthropological literature. He had already hinted at the likelihood of pre-Adamite human life back in 1870, when he suggested that because the Mosaic records represented an advanced population occupying the western reaches of Asia at a period 2,000 or 3,000 years antecedent to our era, there must have been a long interval of human history still anterior to this date. Now, in 1878, it was one of his supporters, David C. Kelly, a local Methodist minister, a scientific progressive, and a member of the Vanderbilt board, who announced that Winchell would deliver a public lecture on the topic races that spring. Winchell was evidently a little taken aback under the circumstances and scribbled rather cryptically in his diary, "Dr. Kelly has advertised me to give a lecture on April 5 on races, horse races perhaps." But he can hardly have been entirely surprised. The race issue hung in the air, not least because his 54-page pamphlet, Adamites and Pre-Adamites, had appeared in the early part of that year, 1878, just shortly after the publication of his lengthy entry on the subject for the Encyclopedia of Biblical, Theological, and Ecclesiastical Literature. The thought that his opponents might have been setting him up certainly crossed some minds, not least when Bishop McTeer suggested that he might take up the subject of evolution for his commencement address. Given the tension in the air, Winchell refused, speaking instead on man in the light of geology. On the very day of the graduation speech, McTeer told him that his scientific views were becoming an embarrassment to the institution, and shortly thereafter he received formal notice that his appointment was now terminated. His views on human origins and anthropological history were certainly now receiving a fairly wide airing. The 1878 pamphlet, for example, was reprinted from the Northern Christian Advocate, and within a couple of years it would be expanded into a monumental 500-page treatise, Pre-Adamites. In all of these outlets Winchell defended the claim that there were human races on the earth prior to the biblical Adam. To Methodist ears it sounded awfully like the polygonism circulating elsewhere, though as we will presently see, this was emphatically not the case. Nevertheless, his citing of certain of its well-known advocates, such as Samuel George Morton and Josiah Nott, and his use of various anthropometric measures typical of that school of thought, no doubt compounded the misapprehension. What was crystal clear was Winchell's conviction that the black races, which he set out to establish as physically, psychically, and socially inferior to whites, were not descended from the biblical Adam but predated him. As he put it in his encyclopedia entry, the conclusion is indicated, therefore, that the common progenitor of the black and the other races was placed too far back in time to answer for the biblical Adam. While Winchell insisted that because the whole issue was a matter of scientific fact, we should unhesitatingly appeal to anthropology for a final answer, his fellow Methodists in the Vanderbilt community did not see it that way. For them the central concern was the implications of Winchell's presumed paganism for their system of theology. What is also clear is that, courtesy of Winchell's pronouncements, the Board of Trustees at Vanderbilt University now occupied a rhetorical space in which evolution and paganism were inextricably intertwined. Under such circumstances racial paganism became the lens through which the local Methodist community's dealings with Darwin were refracted. And the editors of the Nashville American seemed to agree when they commented on Winchell's demise. His development of evolution and paganism caused the abolition of his lectureship. Precisely what was so troubling about Winchell's pre-Adamism remains unclear, though there is no dearth of potential candidates. Anxieties could have sprung from many sources. Perhaps it was because he began both Adamites and pre-Adamites in his entry on the subject for the McClintock and Strong Encyclopedia by advertising the insights of the notorious heretic Isaac LaPeyrère. Readers were told in no uncertain terms that LaPeyrère was a victim of the intolerance of the times and that his insights were far in advance of his age. Later they would learn that he was less impious and mad than the bond slaves of dogma who silenced his tongue. 38 Perhaps it was because his claim that the black races were of pre-Adamic stock seemed to Methodists to place them beyond the scheme of redemption, an embarrassing state of affairs to a denomination currently putting strenuous efforts into church outreach to the black community. Or was it on account of his insistence that Adam was descended from black ancestors and may himself have been of dark complexion? Even Methodist largesse might not stretch that far. Maybe it was simply the postulation of beings to which Genesis bore no witness that caused concern, or Winchell's insistence that there was no evidence of the universality of the deluge of Noah. Whichever was the case, evolution and pre-Adamism proved to be too heady a brew for the Vanderbilt Wesleyans. Just what, then, was the precise shape of Winchell's pre-Adamism? He reviewed the basic narrative in a couple of paragraphs. It was many thousand years ago that the first being appeared which could be called a man. Whether descended from a being unworthy to be called a man, is a collateral question which rests on other foundations. That first of all man did not make his advent in Asia, nor in Europe, nor in America. He appeared either in Africa or in a continental land which stretched from Madagascar to the East Indies. His skin was probably black, and well clothed with hair. He had implanted within him the divine spark of intelligence. He listened to the voice of conscience and felt the claims of duty. If not indigenous in Africa, his descendants took possession of that continent. They spread over Australia and Borneo and the lesser islands of the sea. In the course of thousands of years, they disseminated themselves over considerable portions of Asia. The time arrived, at length, when, under the law of progressive development, a grade had been reached nearly on a level with that of modern civilized man, in respect to native capacities. Now appeared the founder of the Adamic family. His home was in Central Asia. Seth and Cain were either his sons or nations descended from him. He had also other sons and daughters in the same sense. The Sethites and Cainites and other tribes of Adam, as they spread themselves eastward, displaced and at length exterminated the pre-Adamites of Asia. To a considerable degree Winchell's interest in the whole subject sprang from his obsession with racial geography, both historical and contemporary. And his various writings on the subject elaborated, in ever more painstaking detail, on the limited geographical dispersion of what he called the Noachites, Hamites, Semites, and Japhetites, across the Near East, on the major racial divisions of humanity with plentiful illustrations of representative types, and on the divergence of the black races from Adamic anthropology. Ethnic group after ethnic group came within his scrutiny as he traced the global diffusion tracks of the primitive pre-Adamites and plotted their position on his map of world racial genealogy. Questions of Hebrew and Egyptian chronology also surfaced, as did matters of race history and prehistoric archaeology. Evidence available from both Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon skulls was also built into the scheme. Throughout his various pre-Adamite writings Winchell protested the theological propriety of his proposals, but in order to preserve his doctrinal credentials, at least to his own satisfaction, some major structural alterations to the architecture of traditional pre-Adamism had to be undertaken. From the outset it is clear that Winchell intended his account, which postulated that Adam was the natural offspring of pre-Adamite parents, to support monogenism. In 1878 he presented his readers with this version of pre-Adamism as the only way to retain a traditional chronology and yet do justice to empirical findings. If human beings have existed but 6,000 years, then the different races had separate beginnings, as Agassiz long since maintained, each race in its own geographical area, he observed. But if all human beings are descended from one stock, then the starting point was more than 6,000 years back. Because biblical chronology located the Adamic family somewhere around 4000 BC, monogenists simply had no option but to entertain the thought that Adam had ancestors. After all, the evidence of persistence of racial type was very strong. The antiquity of race distinctions, for example, was confirmed from scenes depicted on ancient Egyptian monuments of the 12th dynasty dating from about 1500 BC and from pharaonic portraits of the same era. In the face of such records, Winchell was sure that his pre-Adamism provided chronologists with the temporal safety value they needed. But more, Winchell insisted that his scheme was theologically orthodox. In contrast to polygonism, it acknowledged the unity of man. The possession of one blood by all the races, one moral and intellectual nature, and one destiny. Later in 1880, perhaps to rebut the misinformed charges of his adversaries, he reiterated the point, "I have not disputed the divine creation of Adam, even in maintaining that he had a human father and mother. I have not affirmed, even like McCausland and other ecclesiastical polygamists, that mankind, one in moral nature, are not one in origin, since I believe the blood of the first human stock flows in the veins of every living human being." None of this implied, of course, that any racial group found itself banished beyond the arc of redemption, and Winchell worked hard to provide doctrinal warrant for rejecting the idea that descent from Adam was a prerequisite for regeneration. Certain that heresy hunters were waiting in the wings, he sought to forestall their anxieties about the soteriological status of the pre- and co-Adamites. In his view, pre-Adamism did not interfere with current views of the Catholic scope of the redemptive scheme. Here Winchell worked by analogy with the theological responses to the earlier challenge of the plurality of worlds, the existence of sentient beings on other planets, citing authorities such as Thomas Chalmers, David Brewster, and the Methodist Episcopal Bishop E. M. Marvin, all of whom extended redemptive privileges to other worlds. Winchell's inference was immediate: if redemption could encompass the farthest reaches of space, could it not reach back in time and thereby make provision for the poor pre-Adamites? To this view he added the testimony of the prominent Methodist theologian Daniel Wheaton, who, though remaining skeptical about Adam's ancestry, had written on the retrospective benefits of the atonement and speculated that it could, in principle, incorporate pre-Adamic humanity within its reach, should they have existed. By severing the links between pre-Adamism and polygonism, Winchell helped prepare the way for the later monogenetic version of pre-Adamism that would be deployed as a device for meeting the challenge of human evolution, even though he himself made the conscious decision not to stir up that particular hornet's nest. Nevertheless, he dropped hints of his scheme's evolutionary potential. For one thing, he remained deeply critical of accounts of racial history that presumed black degeneracy from an originally perfect state. To him, progression was the fundamental law of organic life, and this was reflected in his understanding of racial development. Should it be claimed that the white man's Adam had descended from a common stock with the Negro, all nature cries out in assent. But should it be affirmed that the Negro is degenerated from the white man's Adam, every fact in nature shakes its head in denial. What sustained this vision was his version of the pre-Adamite theory. Pre-Adamic monogenism allowed for progress. Universal descent from Adam, understood as the first human being, required regression. Again, he noted that the more we insist on the blood affinity of the races of man, the more we crowd upon attention the query whether a blood affinity may not exist between the lowest race and some type of being a little too low to be called human. At the same time, Winchell was careful not to show his hand too openly. To assert that man has advanced from the lowest human condition, he reflected, is not to assert that this condition was reached by advance from the brute. It is not necessary to assert this, and I wish the reader to note distinctly that none of the conclusions of this work rest on the assumption of man's derivation from a brute ancestor. Man may or may not have had such an origin. I do not trouble myself or the reader with that question. And yet, by calling attention to the inferences that were not immediately to be drawn from monogenetic pre-Adamism, he was all the while raising in some minds the possibility that those very implications, while not self-evident, might nonetheless still be valid. Moreover, when he used evidence from forearm length, pelvic circumference and inclination, and cephalic type to suggest that certain branches of the human race showed signs of being intermediate between the Adamite and the chimpanzee, he was approaching within a hairbreadth some theory of human evolution. His supportive references to the ways in which both Wallace and Mivart had exploited the body-soul dualism to allow for human physical evolution adds further weight to the suspicion that he was sympathetic to an evolutionary interpretation of the human species. To summarize, then, Winchell emphasized the unity of the human species by tracing all human varieties back to an original pre-Adamic stock. The descendants of this primitive group had dispersed from their point of origin across the face of the earth long before the Adamic family had first appeared on the scene of history. Adam's significance, in this schema, was that he was the immediate progenitor of the nations which figure in biblical history, and hence must not be expected to answer the requirements of the primitive ancestor of all mankind. By the time of his appearance, human society was already far advanced. Racially, Adam was the descendant of black forebears. Indeed, rather like James Cowles Pritchard and Dominic McCausland, Winchell interpreted the Hebrew Adamah, redness or ruddiness of color, to imply that Adam himself was, if not pure black, nonetheless strongly colored. That Winchell found himself on the receiving end of Vanderbilt's disapproval does not mean that pre-Adamism was entirely outlawed within the ranks of Methodist orthodoxy. The reception of his work among the upper reaches of the denomination was altogether more sedate. In fact, Daniel Whedon, one of American Methodism's most distinguished intellectual leaders for nearly a quarter-century and editor of the prestigious Methodist Quarterly Review, had already dispassionately reviewed McCausland's volume, and Winchell did not hesitate to quote generously from his liberal-minded review in his own book. Whedon quickly saw how McCausland's ingenious, learned, and eloquent proposals could prevent the violation of the sacred text by safeguarding Old Testament chronology, and thus preferred it to the works of the Duke of Argyll. As for soteriological objections, Whedon insisted, as we have already noted, that the justifying power of Christ's death had a retrospective effect, anonymously citing La Peyrère's own argument that humanity's unity stemmed from moral identification with Adam, not lineal descent from him. By allowing McCausland's, and indeed La Peyrère's, polygenetic pre-Adamism onto the stage of theological acceptability, Whedon thereby gave Winchell the opportunity to justify his own monogenetic version as a good deal less open to charges to heresy. In the long term, however, Whedon turned out to be a wavering ally, and he ultimately drew back from endorsing Winchell's proposals, perhaps because in the interim he had been favorably impressed with Edward Fontaine's ethnological lectures on how the world was peopled, which argued the case for the scientific legitimacy of pan-human derivation from an Adamic pair. Fontaine, a Southern Episcopal clergyman with distinct sympathies for scriptural geology, had accumulated evidence to challenge the antiquity of the earth, and Whedon welcomed his intervention as a serious challenge to Lyell's geology. It was a bitter pill for Winchell to swallow, not least because he had eulogized Whedon as one of the noblest exponents of intelligent theology and too shrewd to be fooled by the shriveled old ogre of orthodoxy, who comes in the garb of Christianity, begging to be defended from the assaults of common sense. This was not the first occasion on which Winchell had cause to feel betrayed by fellow Methodists when he might have expected approbation. His earlier predetermined entry for the McClintock and Strong Encyclopedia is illustrative. The very fact that the compilers allowed Winchell this space is itself significant, of course, suggesting at least that Methodist debate on the subject remained open. And Winchell took the opportunity to pull together the data for human antiquity from cavern fossil bones, stone implements found in river drifts, human remains in loess and moraine deposits, volcanic tuff, peat bogs, kitchen middens, megaliths and tumuli, and lake dwellings, as well as contemporary anthropological research on primitive peoples. But the editors did not deliver the article into Winchell's hands carte blanche. At several key points they appended editorial footnotes contesting, questioning, and undermining his claims. Some of their quibbles were relatively routine, on precise points of information, for example, such as the inadequacy of employing certain astronomical data for dating Egyptian chronology. But other complaints were rather more fundamental. They resisted, for instance, what they took to be Winchell's efforts to force Scripture into harmony with science. Questioning the anthropological conclusions Winchell had drawn from the Hebrew meaning of the term Adam, they hastily affirmed that the statements of Scripture must stand or fall by themselves, when fairly expounded by the usual laws of exegesis, and we are not at liberty to warp them into accommodation with discoveries in other fields. Again, when Winchell argued for Adam's descent from black ancestors on the grounds of progress from inferior stock, they dissented toto coelho, especially from the view that the black races are in any essential point inferior to the others. To them black degradation, a state taken for granted, stemmed from unfavorable surroundings, rather than inherent lack of capacity. To the editors there was ample evidence, too, to confirm that the black races were numbered among the Cushite peoples, and that this realization disposed at once of the argument that Noah is the progenitor of the white races only. All these editorial correctives were brought forward to preserve the traditional Mosaic narrative. But they do reveal the complexity of conceptual allegiances. The editors, biblical traditionalists as they were, clearly displayed their distaste for racist sentiments, whereas Winchell, the scientific luminary, based his rereading of the biblical text on a thoroughly racist anthropology. The links between religious and social conservatism are, on this issue, far from clear-cut. Nevertheless, Winchell did find support from some quarters. An anonymous reviewer for Appleton's Journal commended the step forward that Winchell's pre-Adamites had made in the effort to effect a reconciliation between the conflicting claims of science and religion. With expansive citations, this writer found Winchell's arguments to be very strong and predicted that they would be influential with a certain large class of readers, chiefly because it accords careful and respectful treatment to beliefs and prejudices which are too often dismissed with contempt by those who approach these subjects from the scientific side. And over a decade later, in a belated review of Winchell's treatise for the Methodist Review, Henry Coleman conceded that the theory of pre-Adamites conflicts with no biblical doctrine, and explains some otherwise difficult scripture texts. It is not so connected with Scripture as to become a theological question, and must be decided by geology, ethnology, and history. While he himself considered Winchell's case as not proven, on the grounds of his understanding of current scientific claims, and was pleased to report that the facts of history, secular and scriptural, join in beautiful harmony with the faith. That Adam was the first man, he did mistakenly but illuminatingly refer to La Pereirius, as an Orthodox Dutch, ecclesiastic. Darwinism, pre-Adamites, and conservative theology. Whatever his own personal fate at Vanderbilt, Winchell succeeded in keeping the idea of pre-Adamite humanity before those concerned with the relations between science and religion in the new Darwinian era. Of course, such ideas retained little credibility for those using Darwinism to undermine religion or among those professionalizing scientists who privatized religious belief. Whereas secular versions of pre-Adamism could prevail in the early 19th century because talk of multiple creations provided a shared language among ethnologists and anthropologists, the same simply did not apply to the post-Darwinian scientific scene. Once evolutionary theory, with its naturalistic overtones, had gained a firm foothold, the whole conception of pre-Adamites only made sense to those who still attached some significance to the biblical Adam and who actively sought some rapprochement between evolutionary theory and theology. There were indeed those, such as Ernst Haeckel, who felt that the very idea of a first man simply had no scientific meaning. Haeckel himself was inclined toward monogenism, as he made clear in his 2-volume History of Creation, but he explained that the question of monophyletic or polyphyletic descent, if construed as the search for the first human being, was a fundamentally misconceived project. As he put it, while we for many reasons believe that the different species of speechless primeval men were all derived from a common ape-like form, we do not of course mean to say that all men are descended from one pair. This latter supposition, which our modern Indo-Germanic culture has taken from the Semitic myth of the Mosaic history of creation, is by no means tenable. The whole of the celebrated dispute, as to whether the human race is descended from a single pair or not, rests upon a completely false way of putting the question. It is just as senseless as the dispute as to whether all sporting dogs or all racehorses are descended from a single pair. A first human pair, or a first man, has in fact never existed. Of course, attributing mythological status to aspects of Old Testament theology was not the prerogative of vituperative critics of religion such as Haeckel or Karl Vogt. For long enough there had been theologians, particularly but not exclusively in Germany, who took a higher critical view of Scripture. For them the creation story of Genesis, with its depiction of Adam's creation, probation, and fall, were truly mythological and could therefore be sifted of all scientific content to leave behind the moral message as a sort of spiritual residue. In light of these currents of scientific and theological thought, it is not surprising that the survival of the pre-Adamite was left very largely in the hands of those with more or less conservative religious convictions. Recalling the skeptical origins of the idea and the odor of heresy that long clung to it, this is a notable change of fortune. At the same time, as I have suggested, the theory that remained was transformed. In general terms the pre-Adamite came to be regarded either as a relatively sophisticated descendant of an earlier more savage humanity or as a near-human or subhuman predecessor of the fully human Adam, the first being to be graced with the Imago Dei. As we shall see, such a conception could be interpreted in a variety of ways, but that it was refashioned into an evolutionary form is what most clearly demarcates it from earlier versions of the theory. To illustrate something of this reconfiguration, an examination of several conservative theological engagements with ideas about human evolution during the final decades of the 19th century and up to the middle of the 20th will serve to disclose something of the dimensions of this conceptual realignment. Because the apologetic legacy of these thinkers was so enduring, their use of heretical pre-Adamite thought forms seems all the more significant. Protestant proposals. because he occupied a chair of the Harmony of Science and Revealed Religion specially created for him at Princeton in 1865, the first of its kind in any American college. The pronouncements of Charles Woodruff Shields on the subject of human origins inevitably invite our perusal. Both his institutional affiliation and his self-appointed task of surveying the entire gamut of scientific and theological learning in the immediate aftermath of the Darwinian onslaught prepare us for a Presbyterian perspective on the question. Predictably, his monumental Conspectus Philosophiae Ultima or Science of the Sciences of 1888 to 1905, a work inviting comparison with the grand synthetic panoramas of Herbert Spencer or John Fiske, took up the disparate claims of rational, scientific, anthropology as compared with those of revealed, scriptural, anthropology. Shields was clearly familiar with the pre-Adamite theory both in its role as an anthropological thesis and as a strategy for harmonizing science and scripture, and his references throughout the work to the writings of figures such as Giordano Bruno, Isaac Lapeyrère, Lord Kames, Louis Agassiz, Josiah Nott, George Gliddon, Dominic McCausland, Reginald Stuart Poole, and a host of others displayed his considerable erudition. At this juncture Shields's aim was simply to lay before his public the range of scientific theories available, but it was already plain that he harbored some sympathy for the pre-Adamite theory. Thus, he was discouraged to find, for example, that the guardians of orthodoxy in our day are denouncing Agassiz and Edward Forbes for a theory of co-Adamite races, which might really support their own doctrine of a high Adamic covenant, as distinguished from mere inherited sin. By this assertion Shields intended to intimate that Adam could be conceived of as representative of the entire human species irrespective of time or place and thereby relieve anthropology of the burden of commitment to universal descent from the Adamic pair. As he put it, whether the human family be of one race or many races, the first Adam and the second Adam would still be their chief moral representatives. So it was no surprise that in 1900 he would announce that the Genesis record dealt with the Adamic Caucasian race as a typical or representative segment of the entire human family and the bearer of salvation to the world, a view clearly assuming the continued survival of both pre- and co-Adamites across the reaches of history's stage. Thus far, Shields's affirmations did not go beyond an endorsement of standard polygenetic pre-Adamism. But there are hints that he was moving toward an evolutionary reworking of the concept. He had, for instance, no sooner introduced Lapeyrère's system to his readers as first a Protestant infidel, then a Catholic priest of the Oratory, than he immediately went on to link it both with the polygenesis of Agassiz and with Bishop Joseph Butler's treatment of several questions of recent anthropology, such as the material origin of man, his development from an animal state, and his gradual predominance as the governing animal in our globe. And having made this connection, he presently added that earlier students of biblical anthropology such as John Calvin and Theodore Beza were writing at a time when it was too soon as yet to attempt any scientific verification of dogmas, such as is beginning to be made, by associating co-Adamite and pre-Adamite theories of the savage and animal origin of man, with the special divine dispensation to Adam as the natural progenitor of the Caucasian race and federal representative of the whole human family. But Shields could foresee a time, not far distant, when the secular evolution of Adam from the animal species shall be claimed to be as scriptural and orthodox as that of the animal from the vegetable races, or that of the organized planet from the inorganic nebula. At this stage he himself was rather hesitant to adopt too rapidly what he called the eclectic spirit, despite the lead given by Chancellor Winchell and St. George Mivart, the distinguished Roman Catholic naturalist, and he certainly was biting in his cryptic dismissal of the pre-Adamism of primeval man unveiled, whose anonymous author, James Gall, strangely blended the wildest illusions of angelology with the latest speculations of the ethnologist. For all that, drawing inspiration from Dr. M.C. Koch, who, from the first has led the creationists into alliance with the evolutionists, Shields had come to the opinion that from present signs it would seem that the tide of controversy has turned in favor of evolutionism in some form and degree. As it turned out, he was remarkably prescient in his predictions, and his own resort to a covenantal conception of the fall, which emphasized Adam's representativeness of the whole human species without reference to inheritance, as crucial to mediation between scripture and evolutionary anthropology, was a move that later conservative theologians would make for precisely the same ends. Hence, it is not surprising to find Shields himself affirming, in 1900, in terms remarkably similar to Mivart, that if the creation of man was to be regarded as a process rather than as an act, it would be conceivable that the animal organism of man could have been endowed with psychical qualities and divine resemblances, as new miraculous acts or subsequent processes during the historic period. If Shields sought an evangelical benediction on his evolutionary reading of the human story, he needed to look no farther than to two figures sharing his own campus, Reverend George McCloskey, who crossed the Atlantic from Ireland in 1875 to take up the new chair of natural history at the College of New Jersey, as Princeton was then called, and the recently appointed professor of didactic and polemic theology in the Princeton Seminary, Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield, who assumed that position in 1887. One or two comments on these voices, sympathetic as they were to Darwinism, will serve to illustrate some of the conceptual moves that were being advanced in the effort to reconstruct theological anthropology on evolutionary foundations. McCluskey's appointment to his position was something of a last resort for James McCosh, the Princeton president, who had found it extraordinarily difficult to fill the post. By securing the services of his former Irish student, McCosh at last found a candidate with his own inclinations, both theological and evolutionary. Over the years McCluskey assumed the role of purveyor of science to the Presbyterian fraternity both through various speaking engagements and his regular articles on scientific subjects for the denomination's magazines. Thus, in the late 1880s and 1890s and into the early years of the 20th century, he drew the attention of his fellow Presbyterians to a range of matters of pressing scientific and theological import: the role of speculation in science, accommodationist strategies, and theistic evolution. As part of this enterprise, it is not surprising that the pre-Adamites fell under his scrutiny, and in a listing of topics taken up for discussion on science and faith in 1892, they took their place alongside such other issues as the iconoclasm of science, creation, evolution, the right attitude, creation of man, and the deluge. McCluskey's notes disclose only the sketchiest of impressions of his approach to the subject, save that he identified La Peyrère as its source and portrayed John Pye Smith and Alexander Winchell as its latter-day representatives. But he did make it clear that the theory of pre-Adamites does not affect the unity of the race, while at the same time noting that the Bible seems to set forth Adam as our first father and that Winchell exaggerates the difference between Negro and white. From other writings, however, we can readily infer the kind of pre-Adamism that is likely to have attracted McCluskey's interest. It is not difficult to excavate the foundations on which the architecture of McCluskey's conception of human evolution stood. Two articles published around the turn of the 20th century articulate his stance. In his account of theistic evolution in 1898 he paused to comment on the implications of the theory for human origins. It has been recognized that man may have been both created and evolved, he wrote, that his creation may have been effected under divinely directed evolution, either as a natural development, or possibly as a development with supernatural incidents and expedited. We are satisfied, he went on, that it is not right to hold the hypothesis of evolution as applied to the human race to signify that there could be no pair of first parents and no fall into sin. The most generally accepted views of human evolution will favor the monogenistic view, which signifies an ancestral pair. Evidently, McCluskey entertained the likelihood that the biblical Adam was the descendant of some pre-Adamic stock. And to some degree at any rate, Darwin could be called his supporting witness. 5 years later McCluskey turned yet more specifically to the same subject, and here his espousal of a Mivart-style solution to the question clearly surfaced. Evolution, he gladly announced, destroyed Louis Agassiz's theories that the different races could not be descended from common ancestors, and also the strange fancies that many of the animals and plants were created in multiple. Darwinism had obliterated polygonism. In its place there was increasing recognition, and justly so, that man has somehow been evolved. Where did that leave Adam? McCluskey was clear: evolution will be held by the biblicist to be a part, the naturalistic part, of the total work of his making, the other part being his endowment miraculously with a spiritual nature, so that he was created in the image of God. As a member of the animal kingdom, man was created by God, probably in the same naturalistic fashion as the beasts that perish, but unlike them, he has endowments which point to a higher, namely a supernaturalistic, order of creation. By present showing, man's evolution would probably consist in the production of a single pair of ancestors. Further support for this kind of maneuver was forthcoming from McCluskey's colleague at the Princeton Seminary, B. Warfield, an immense authority within late 19th and 20th century Reformed theology and a supporter of evolution. That Warfield had found the conceptual resources in the long-established distinction between primary and secondary causes to meet the challenge of Darwinian biology was crucial to the story he wanted to tell about the origins of humanity. And indeed, he had already expressed enthusiasm for Shields's efforts along these lines in Philosophia Ultima. Before specifying the precise theological arrangements he envisaged, it is worth reflecting on his approach to the pre-Adamite theory more generally. In 1911 Warfield wrote an article for the Princeton Theological Review on the antiquity and unity of the human race. Because he felt that the mere age of the human race was irrelevant to theology, He moved on to discuss theories that bore on the unity or diversity of the species and to review some of the major scientific theories available. On turning to pre-atomism, he made a number of telling observations that throw much light on his own treatment of the subject. To him, polygonism was to be equated with the co-atomitism of writers such as Paracelsus, and not with pre-atomism, as was conventionally assumed. In his mind, co-atomitism was the attribution of the descent of the several chief racial types to separate original ancestors, whereas pre-atomitism conceives man indeed as a single species, derived from one stock, but represents Adam not as the root of this stock, but as one of its products. The writings of Zanini, Zaninus de Sasha, who is said to have been condemned in 1495 for believing in the existence of inhabited worlds before Adam, Isaac Laperriere, and Alexander Winchell, he reported, represented the monogenetic pre-Adamite theory, while Arthur de Gobineau, Josiah C. Nott, George Gliddon, Louis Agassiz, and Cordonier were advocates of polygenetic co-atomism. Warfield himself warmed to neither of these versions. On the one hand, he loathed polygonism in every shape and form, as well as the racial pride that typically went with it, and on the other, he believed that Christianity's theological structure was bound up with Adam as the father of all humanity, not just of the Jews. Yet he did make reference to another sort of pre-Adamitism, that has continued to be taught by a series of philosophical speculators from Schelling down, which looks upon Adam as the first real man, rising in developed humanity above the low, beast-like condition of his ancestors. There Warfield left the matter, but his insistence that monogenism was a necessary corollary of the evolutionary hypothesis already raised the suspicion that this other sort of pre-Adamism might have some validity. These inklings are not confirmed until we turn to Warfield's own views on the emergence of the human species. In an exposition of Calvin's doctrine of the creation in 1915, he made the case that Calvin had restricted the term creation to the initial act of creation ex nihilo. The only exception to this was the creation of the soul, for Calvin held to the creationist, as opposed to the traducianist view, that every human soul throughout the history of propagation was an immediate, not mediate, creation. Traducianists, by contrast, insisted that the spiritual component of humanity was transmitted through natural generation, not divine intervention. Accordingly, because all other modifications of what he termed the primeval and digested mass were by means of the interaction of its intrinsic forces, Warfield could claim that Calvin's was a very pure evolutionary scheme. So far as the human species was concerned, it left open the possibility that the human body might have undergone a long history of evolutionary modification before receiving, by an act of immediate creation, a soul. Thus, when Warfield came to reviewing James Orr's God's Image in Man, he allowed as a distinct possibility that the human body had been formed in emergent evolutionary fashion, at a leap from brutish parents, and then fitted with a truly human soul. The compatibility of this conception with the alternative pre-Adamite scheme that Warfield himself had identified is clearly apparent. If Warfield left evolutionary pre-Adamism as an inference to be drawn from his writings, other Protestant conservatives were explicit in their consideration of this possibility. Take, for example, A. Rendell Short, the Royal College of Surgeons Hunterian professor. Short was a distinguished surgeon and vigorous evangelical apologist, and in the latter capacity he took up the subject of the problem of man's origin in a volume on science and the Bible that appeared during the 1930s. Here he hinted at the possibility that there might conceivably have been pre-Adamite creatures with the body and mind of a man, but not the spirit and capacity for God and eternity. Certainly at this stage, he concluded that all this was very difficult and speculative, but by 1942, when he produced Modern Discovery in the Bible, a work destined to remain popular within British evangelicalism, he was rather more enthusiastic. Now he pointed out that it was by no means certain that Homo neanderthalensis was to be regarded as man in the Bible sense of the word. Rather, the Neanderthals could well be pre-Adamite. Indeed, it was just possible that the biblical Adam could have been formed by the infusion of spiritual qualities into some pre-Adamic creature. As he explained, they, the Neanderthals, may have been pre-Adamic, and Adam verily was a new creation, with spiritual qualities that they lacked. What sort of material the Creator used to make man, whether the dust of the earth directly, or the pre-existing body of a beast, we leave an open question. While Short thus allowed the possibility of human evolution, he was far from happy with the conventional Darwinian explanation and found himself much more inclined toward the mutation theory of Lev Simonovich Berg, the Russian geographer and ichthyologist. Accordingly, he spelled out in some detail the evidence that Berg had accumulated in support of what he called nomogenesis. Its significance in the present context is simply that it kept open the possibility of an evolutionary jump from pre-Adamite to Adamite, precisely the sort of arrangement that Warfield had envisaged. This option, as we will later see, was one that conservative Protestants concerned to maintain good relations between science and religion would continue to deploy throughout the second half of the 20th century. Catholic considerations. On the whole, Catholic thinkers have been rather less welcoming to the pre-Adamites than their Protestant counterparts, though there is clear evidence here, too, of the infiltration of evolutionary pre-Adamism into certain strands of the Catholic tradition. What further complicates the story are the cultural politics that long attended discussion about Darwinism in Catholic circles. The opposition to evolution among a group of Jesuit thinkers from the 1860s brought together by Pope Pius IX to combat the forces of modernity found expression in the pages of La Civiltà Cattolica. G. B. Piancini, for example, insisted on the need to retain the fixity of species against Lamarckian ideas of transformism. Nevertheless, the official custodians of Catholic dogma did not take any action against Catholic evolutionists until the 1890s, when attitudes began to harden as the aging Pope Leo XIII, hitherto a force for moderation, lost ground to the increasing influence of Roman Jesuits and the machinations of the Civiltà Cattolica coterie. The French Dominican priest Almas Leroy, author of The Evolution of Organic Species, first published in French in 1887, and the American John Zahm, who played a significant role in the development of the University of Notre Dame in Indiana and published Evolution and Dogma in 1896, particularly came under fire. Both these writers protested the theological acceptability of evolution, albeit within certain limits. Leroy's Apologia, erected foursquare on Mivart's foundations, was directed against both atheistic renditions of evolution and theological enemies of the theory. But because Leroy hinted that the human body might be the product of evolutionary forces, the cardinal prefect of the Sacred Congregation of the Index of Prohibited Books considered the evolution of organic species to be unacceptable. Although the finding that his book was censured was conveyed to him privately, as the decree was not made public, Leroy was devastated, and he speedily retracted it in March 1895. It was much the same with Zahm. While he had earlier condemned Darwin's descent of man as the cause of social inequity, his purpose in writing Evolution and Dogma was to demonstrate its theological acceptability. Likewise inspired by Mivart's perspective, the brilliant author of The Genesis of Species, as he styled him, Zahm turned to what he called the simian origin of man toward the end of his analysis. Here he engaged in detailed patristic exegesis to justify a teleological rendering of evolution and to claim that the animal origins of Adam's body were compatible with the theology of Augustine and Aquinas. Defending the creationist, as opposed to traducianist, explanation of the human soul as a direct divine creation for each and every human individual, he argued that Aquinas's understanding of the creation of Adam was in keeping with the generation of the human soul ex nihilo and the evolutionary production of a substratum, into which the Creator breathed the breath of life. In sum, in the development of man, as in that of the lower animals, there is an ascending succession of substantial forms, by means of which that which is destined to become a human body, acquires a proper structure and receives the necessary disposition for becoming the receptacle of a rational soul. The book was an international success, and an Italian translation rapidly appeared, but readers of a fuming Civiltà Cattolica were assured that it was all a tissue of lies, redolent with reckless assertions and hopelessly compromised by dubious assumptions. The Congregation of the Index denounced it in 1897, focusing very largely on the matter of human origins. Like Leroy, Zahm reportedly withdrew his efforts despite the favorable review he received the following year from the English Bishop John Cuthbert Headley, who, for his pains, was presently condemned by Civiltà Cattolica. Various factors played their parts in these intrigues. A fear of Americanism, the tendency on the part of American Catholics to display intellectual independence and to adapt Catholicism to an American context, was one such force. Another suite of concerns rotated around the routine conflation of Darwinism and modern scholarly trends, notably the new biblical criticism. Reactions to evolutionary biology were thus often all of a piece with responses to wider challenges to established ways of thinking. Critical, too, was the matter of intellectual authority and who had the right to interpret the tradition's received canon. Those who found evolution in the writings of Aquinas and Augustine were arrogantly failing to pay due deference to the history of neo-scholastic commentary. Later on, fears of Darwinian-inspired eugenic policies played their role in shaping Catholic evaluations of evolution. Yet despite Huxley's efforts to proscribe Mivart's Catholic Darwinism, the difficulties that Leroy and Zahm experienced at the hands of the Congregation of the Index, and the more general anxiety over modernizing trends and culture, a succession of Catholic scholars have continued to defend the theological propriety of a circumscribed Darwinism and to rethink the status of the biblical Adam in light of evolution. and it was at this fulcrum point between evolutionary theory and exegesis of the Genesis text that the pre-Adamite theory manifested itself. On at least one element in the nexus of pre-Adamite ideas, however, the Catholic tradition has remained uncompromisingly hostile, namely, the belief in the continued existence of pre-Adamites alongside the Adamic family. This version of co-Adamism was branded as heretical by Christian Pesch in 1910, while the papal encyclical of 1950, Humani Generis, to which we will later return, reinforced the stance that Christ's faithful cannot embrace the opinion that after Adam there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him. In the interim, Humphrey Johnson's hearty defense of monogenism during the interwar years prompted him to query the once fashionable suggestion that Neolithic man was Adamite and Paleolithic man pre-Adamite. To him that maneuver was gratuitous. Provided that we do not demand any high degree of mental development in the first true man, he affirmed, there is no very grave difficulty in deriving all rational beings who have ever inhabited our planet, from one pair. Thus, Johnson's rejection of polygenetic pre-Adamism was orchestrated by pushing the date of Adam's first appearance farther and farther back in time. In order to sustain his reading of race history, moreover, he had to couple his monogenetic stance with a belief in retrogression. In fact, he later argued in 1950 that the discovery in Palestine and Moreira, Spain, of fossilized human remains exhibiting a combination of modern and Neanderthaloid features suggested that the two racial types were less divergent than at first believed. Moreover, the fact that those Neanderthal skulls in which the pithecoid traits are most accentuated are chronologically the most recent, was an indication that retrogression has been at work. Such a stance, of course, had ideological possibilities, particularly when linked to the outmoded theory of ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny. So, for all his commitment to the organic unity of the race, he openly declared that because the history of the individual recapitulates the history of race, we may infer that the backward races of mankind, such as the Negro and the Australian, are to some extent mental degenerates. The monogenist cast of Catholic thought, however, needs to be interpreted with caution, not least because monogenism is entirely compatible, as we have seen, with at least certain versions of pre-Adamism, and, as if to confirm that very point, O. W. Garrigan noted in 1967 that for Catholics any pre-Adamite hypothesis must allow in some way for the doctrine of original sin and the unity of the present human race. The appearance of pre-Adamites from time to time in post-Darwinian Catholic literature is not unexpected. Thus, the geologist Anne Joly, in his 1883 Men Before Metals, which appeared in Appleton's International Scientific Series, cited a certain Abbé Fabre as asserting that prehistoric archaeology and paleontology may, without running counter to the scriptures, discover in the tertiary beds and in those of the early part of the Quaternary the traces of pre-Adamites. Since it disregards all creations anterior to the last deluge but one Bible revelation leaves us free to admit the existence of man in the Great Diluvium, in Pliocene and even in Eocene strata. Again in 1913, A. J. Mass allowed for the possibility of preadamism when he asserted that the existence of a human race, or human races, extinct before the time of Adam, is as little connected with the truth of our revealed dogmas as the question whether one or more of the stars are inhabited by rational beings resembling man, and he called on the supporting testimony of Catholic dogmaticians such as Domenico Palmieri and Jules Fabre d'Anvaux. Nevertheless, although Mass did not outlaw pre-Adamism, he felt that neither the scientific evidence nor La Peyrère's theological system were compelling, nor was what he called the political-social pre-Adamism of McCausland, Poole, and the American polygenetic ethnologists. These brief admissions of the pre-Adamites into Catholic conversation prepare the way for some further treatments of human evolution by Catholic writers during the first half of the 20th century and the generation after the Leroy-Zam controversies. The contributions of Henry de Dorladat, priest, theologian, and director of the Geological Institute at Louvain University in Belgium, are a convenient point of access to these debates. Dorladat made no secret of his evolutionary convictions and took up the whole subject for a series of lectures during World War I. A limited edition of them was printed in 1918, though they were apparently antedated to avoid German censure and appeared with a 1913 imprint under the title Le Darwinisme au point de vue de l'orthodoxie catholique. In 1922 an English translation appeared as Darwinism and Catholic Thought. It was substantially a theological work devoted to an elucidation of the writings in the classical Catholic tradition in order to substantiate their compatibility with evolution. Accordingly, Dorladat perused and commented on the relevant encyclicals, the Biblical Commission of Leo XIII, and the exegesis of the Hexameron, as well as the writings of the Fathers and the Aristotelian scholastics, and showed to his own satisfaction that they cohered with the natural evolutionary account of species transformation. Throughout the lectures he relied on the time-honored distinction between primary and secondary causes. As for the question of human evolution, Dorladat resorted to Catholic principles of embryological development and cited St. Thomas Aquinas to substantiate the view that the human embryo before it reaches a state fitted to be animated by the intellectual soul must have been animated successively, not simply by a vegetative soul and then by an animal soul, but rather must have passed, per multas generationes et corruptions, through a great number of substantial transformations. For Dorladat the only break in the chain of natural evolution was the creation of the human soul, a view much in keeping with that of his friend and colleague Mivart. Whatever feathers Dorladat ruffled in Rome, the book was enthusiastically received by English-speaking Catholic reviewers. The English translator of Dorladat's work, the Jesuit Ernest C. Messenger, also contributed significantly to the Catholic debate on evolution with his own Evolution and Theology, which understandably drew on Dorladat's historical groundwork, so much so that one reviewer quipped that the best parts of his book were those based on Dorladat's analysis. Here again much space was devoted to the elucidation of traditional Catholic sources, St. Ephrem, St. Basil, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Ambrose, and so on, all to support the legitimacy of the thesis that the creation of species was by natural causes. Then he moved on to a much more detailed examination of human origins, arguing that the emergence of the human race by way of phylogenetic descent was entirely compatible with tradition and that opposition from modern theologians stemmed from their overly literalistic reading of the Old Testament. At this point Messenger paused to introduce the pre-Adamites. As much as anything else, they performed the useful function of accounting for the many apparently imperfect types of humanity which recent archaeology has revealed. If they were fully human and had not died out by the time of Adam's appearance, he argued, the need for direct divine intervention in the emergence of Adam's body would have been unnecessary. If that was not the case, and some special divine activity were involved at this point to prepare the body for the infusion of the soul, Messenger was nonetheless certain that because the whole purpose of creation was to lead up to man, it was in every way fitting that God should thus have made use of secondary causes in the formation of Adam's body and that other pre-Adamic creatures may have taken an active part in preparing for his coming. Messenger's work received fairly wide distribution in the years immediately after 1931, but stock copies of the book were destroyed in air raids on England during World War II. Nevertheless, it certainly had provoked a spate of comment in the Catholic press, and so, in 1949, Messenger brought out a collection of these essays under the title Theology and Evolution. Many of his reviewers painstakingly interrogated Catholic tradition to determine the legitimacy of Messenger's reading, and many of the arguments and counter-arguments addressed subjects no less central to conservative Protestant theology. The nuances of the debate need not detain us further, save to note that when P.G.M. Rhodes, a sympathetic commentator, observed that it may well be imagined that God so directed the course of evolution that animals which might be described as subhuman came into existence, possessing nearly, but not quite, the human configuration, without the rational soul, this was very largely the monogenetic pre-Adamism that had emerged in the wake of Darwinian evolution. In his deliberations Messenger added a further dimension to the Catholic debate on human evolution that revolved around embryology and its analogical significance. After presenting a thumbnail sketch of the history of embryology and reprinting an address he had given on Aquinas' embryological thought, he used these reflections to vindicate the mediate animation theory that Dorladat had championed. The argument centered on the question of when the soul entered the human fetus. Messenger and Dorladat both urged that the idea of its infusion only after a certain period of development, hence, mediate rather than immediate animation, was thoroughly in keeping with tradition. The discussion soon moved off into questions of technical Catholic dogmatics, but its significance to the pre-Adamite question stemmed from its bearing on the issue of recapitulation. To be sure, Messenger felt that Haeckel's law of recapitulation, as originally formulated, had little to command it. But viewed in the light of the Thomas theory of the succession of forms in the human embryo, it is highly suggestive, he posited. For, if a human being at the present time goes through first a vegetative and then a sensitive or animal stage, it is difficult not to think it likely that the human race as a whole may have had a similar history. What this idea opened up was the possibility that in a natural succession of evolutionary forms, humanization took place at some point along the sequence, both for the individual and the human race. Or to put it another way, just as the soul entered the body after a period of natural development, so too the first complete human, Adam, might well have had pre-Adamic hominid-like predecessors,